on a quiet night when the world begins to fall asleep. There are stories that whisper to the heart and remind us of truths we often forget. Imagine a small sparrow, fragile and trembling, caught in the bitter cold of winter. Its wings are thin like fragile pieces of paper, its breath barely holding on. At that moment, everything seems hopeless until compassion appears, as gentle as a candle flame in the darkness. This is not only the tale of a bird, but also a mirror for our own lives. We too stumble. We too feel small in the face of life's storms. Yet, just as a single act of kindness can save a sparrow, a single moment of compassion can transform our world. Compassion does not belong only to humans. It flows through rivers, through trees, through every living being that breathes alongside us. Tonight, as you listen, allow this story to soften your heart. Let it guide you into rest, where peace and empathy can wrap around you like a warm blanket. Stay with me, because within these simple moments lies a timeless wisdom waiting to be discovered. If you find comfort here, remember to subscribe to Buddhism for sleep, where every night brings a new story of kindness, mindfulness, and the gentle path toward peace. Your journey to serenity begins right now. Let us take the first step together. The little sparrow was born in the quiet corner of a countryside village, where the wind often carried the fragrance of rice fields and the sound of leaves, trembling under the gentle breeze. Its wings were fragile and its eyes still filled with wonder as it looked upon the vast sky that seemed so unreachable. Every morning it would wake with the first rays of the sun, chirping softly as if to greet the day. Life appeared simple, but the sparrow had no idea how the world could change with seasons and how harshness sometimes followed beauty. One day, as autumn faded and winter crept silently into the land, the fields that once glowed with golden grains turned into emptiness. The air that once held warmth now carried only a bitter chill. The sparrow flapped its wings harder, trying to find crumbs of food left behind, yet the earth seemed stingy and unkind. Hunger gnawed at its little body, and the cold made its feathers stiff. Still, the sparrow carried on, flying from branch to branch with the hope that somewhere kindness awaited. Deep within its small heart, there was no bitterness, only the quiet acceptance of life's trials. As it flew over a small cottage, it saw smoke rising from the chimney. The scent of burning firewood drifted into the air. It longed to come closer, but feared the unknown of human presence. Yet hunger pushed it to risk what it had never dared before. It perched timidly near the window, where inside a gentle old man sat, his hair white as snow and his eyes reflecting years of quiet wisdom. The man noticed the sparrow shivering on the sill, instead of chasing it away as some might. He slowly opened the window and whispered softly as though speaking to a dear friend. The sparrow startled, but did not fly away. There was something about the man's voice that carried warmth like a mother's embrace. The old man placed a handful of grains on the ledge and stepped back, watching with patience. The sparrow tilted its head, uncertain but drawn by hunger and by the calm energy radiating from the man. Cautiously, it hopped closer, pecked at the grains, and for the first time in days felt the relief of fullness. The old man smiled quietly and returned to his seat by the fire, letting the sparrow eat without disturbance. This simple act became the beginning of an unspoken bond. Day after day, the sparrow returned, and day after day, the old man shared what little he had. Sometimes just a few crumbs, sometimes warm water in a tiny bowl. He did not expect gratitude, nor did the sparrow know how to give it beyond its cheerful chirps that filled the lonely cottage with life. The winter outside raged with cold winds. Snow covered the fields. Yet inside that small space by the fire and near the window, compassion created a different world where loneliness faded and survival turned into shared companionship. The sparrow began to trust. It would perch on the man's shoulder, its tiny claws barely pressing against his worn clothes. Sometimes it would sing softly, and the old man would close his eyes, letting the music of a small bird soothe his tired heart. He was a man who had lived alone for many years, his children long gone to distant lands, his wife passed away, and his home was filled with silence until the sparrow arrived. He had thought his days would end in solitude, but now, every morning, he looked forward to the soft flutter of wings and the chirping that called him to another day. And in that rhythm of giving and receiving, something sacred was born. Not in temples or scriptures, but in the very act of kindness offered without condition. Outside the world was harsh, but inside a lesson was quietly unfolding. That no matter how small a being may appear, its life is precious. And every act of compassion, no matter how simple, becomes a bridge that connects souls. The sparrow could not speak words, yet in its presence, the old man felt understood. It was as though the universe had sent a reminder that he was not alone and that love was still possible. Night after night, the sparrow would rest in a small basket lined with cloth near the fire, safe from the cruel cold, and the old man would look at it with tenderness, sometimes whispering prayers not for himself, but for the little creature, wishing that it would survive and one day fly freely again. Such is the power of compassion. It transforms loneliness into connection and transforms fear into trust. And while the snow fell endlessly outside the window, within that humble cottage, the warmth of kindness burned brighter than any flame. And thus began the true story of the sparrow and the man whose heart still knew how to love beyond the boundaries of species. For what is compassion, if not the recognition that all beings seek happiness and fear suffering? And what is wisdom, if not the courage to act upon that truth? As days stretched into weeks, the bond between them grew deeper. Each morning the sparrow would flutter its wings as though to greet the rising sun together with the man. And each night they would fall asleep in the glow of the fire, wrapped in a silence that no longer felt empty but alive with presence. The world outside remained indifferent, but within this small sanctuary, compassion had found a home. And in that home life blossomed again in its most tender form. As the winter deepened and snow continued to blanket the fields in a silent and merciless whiteness, the old man and the sparrow lived day by day in a rhythm that seemed timeless. The sparrow had grown stronger, its feathers more resilient, its eyes brighter, yet it still carried within it the fragility of all small creatures that live under the mercy of nature. One stormy evening, when the wind howled through the cracks of the wooden cottage and the fire flickered under the force of the cold, the sparrow huddled close to the man, trembling slightly as though sensing that beyond the comfort of their shared space, the world remained unforgiving. The man gently cupped his hands around the sparrow, feeling its tiny heartbeat quicken against his palms, and he whispered words that were not planned but arose naturally from the depth of his being, words of reassurance and blessing, words that spoke of survival and the promise of another dawn. The sparrow tilted its head as though listening with complete trust, and in that moment the old man realized that even without shared language, there was a communication more profound than words. The next morning, when the storm had passed, the sky revealed a pale sun that shone weakly through the mist. The sparrow stretched its wings and flew a little higher around the cottage, circling as if to celebrate life. The old man watched with a mixture of pride and tenderness, for he knew that the sparrow's flight was a symbol of resilience and hope, and he thought to himself, that perhaps this was the reason life had brought this small bird to him, not only for the sparrow to survive, but for his own heart to awaken again to the beauty of caring for another being. As the days passed, he began to prepare small meals, more carefully setting aside a portion each day for his guest. He cut wood with a renewed sense of purpose, because he no longer felt he was keeping the fire only for himself. The sound of the sparrow became the melody of his mornings, and the warmth of its presence became the comfort of his nights. One afternoon, a group of children from the village passed by and noticed the sparrow perched happily on the old man's shoulder. They giggled and whispered to one another, surprised that such a wild bird could be so trusting of a human. The old man smiled gently but said nothing. He simply let them see the harmony that had blossomed between them. In a world where many overlooked the small and the weak, he wanted the children to witness how compassion could build trust and how trust could bring joy. The children never forgot that image, and later, when they told their parents, the story spread quietly among the villagers. Some were skeptical, others touched, but all began to see the old man not as the lonely figure in the distant cottage, but as someone who had found a rare companionship that reminded them of values often forgotten. Winter dragged on longer than usual, and food became scarcer, yet the old man never once considered turning the sparrow away. He remembered the days when he himself had gone hungry, and how even then he longed not for abundance, but for kindness to share the burden. So he gave without hesitation, and in giving he found a strange fullness in his own heart that made hunger easier to bear. One day, the sparrow did not return at its usual hour of morning. The old man waited by the window, feeling a quiet worry settle into his chest. Hours passed, and still there was no flutter of wings. By afternoon, his heart grew heavy. He walked outside into the snow, calling softly, though he knew the bird could not understand his words. His footprints left long trails across the frozen ground. He searched near the trees and by the river that had frozen into silence. At last, near a cluster of bushes, he found the sparrow, weak and shivering, its feathers damp and its energy nearly gone. He gently scooped it into his hands, bringing it back to the warmth of the fire once. Inside, he dried its feathers carefully with a cloth and held it close until its trembling slowed. He whispered that it was safe, that it was home, and in that moment he realized the depth of his bond with the sparrow. It was no longer just a guest. It had become a part of his very existence. In its survival, he found meaning, and in its presence, he found companionship. The sparrow slowly recovered, chirping faintly as though thanking him for not giving up, and from that day onward, the old man promised himself that he would guard this small life with all he had, even if the world outside grew harsher, for he knew that compassion was not measured by the size of the act, but by the sincerity of the heart. Winter finally began to loosen its grip. The snow melted into streams that trickled through the fields. The trees began to show tiny buds, and the air carried the faint scent of spring. The sparrow, now stronger than ever, stretched its wings with eagerness to test the skies once again. It flew higher than before, circling joyfully in the open air. The old man watched from below, a mixture of joy and sadness filling him. He knew that the sparrow's nature was to fly free, not to remain confined within the walls of his home, even if those walls had provided shelter and safety. So one morning, when the sparrow perched on the window ledge, ready to take flight, the old man whispered a blessing, telling it to go where the wind carried it, to live fully as it was meant to live. His voice trembled, but his heart was steady, for he understood that true compassion was not possession, but liberation. The sparrow chirped as though acknowledging his words, then with a graceful leap it soared into the sky, disappearing into the horizon. The old man stood at the window long after it had gone, tears glistening in his eyes, not of sorrow but of gratitude for the time they had shared. He turned back into his cottage, now filled with silence, yet within him there was no emptiness. for he carried the memory of a small life that had taught him how to love again. And as he sat by the fire, he reflected that perhaps all beings, great and small, came into our lives for a reason, to remind us that kindness is the essence of living, and that to give love freely is to find peace within himself. He felt that peace settle gently into his heart, like the sparrow's song, lingering even in its absence, and with that peace he closed his eyes and whispered a prayer that every creature under the vast sky might find compassion somewhere in this world. The days passed and spring unfolded with soft colors across the land. The old man often sat by the window, gazing at the fields that once were buried in snow, now alive with fresh green shoots and gentle blossoms. Yet in his heart he carried the memory of the little sparrow that had flown away to freedom. He wondered if it would return, if the bond they had shared would bring it back to the cottage that had been both a refuge and a home for those long months of winter. He never tried to hold on to the thought too tightly, because he knew compassion meant letting go. Still, each morning his ears would strain for the sound of wings or the familiar chirp that had once filled his lonely days. One early morning, while mist still clung to the ground and the dew shimmered on the leaves, he heard a faint flutter outside, and when he opened the door, his heart leaped with joy, for there on the branch of a young tree sat the sparrow, its feathers shining in the new sun, and to his surprise, beside it were two other sparrows, smaller and timid, as though they were following the lead of their companion. The old man smiled so deeply his eyes filled with tears. He realized that the sparrow had returned, not alone, but with new life, perhaps its mate, or perhaps young ones, who now looked to it for guidance. Whatever the story was, he felt honored that the bird had chosen to return. The sparrow chirped loudly, as though announcing that it had come back, and it hopped closer until it landed on the old man's shoulder, just as it used to. The two smaller birds followed nervously, but soon they too felt the safety that the man's gentle presence offered. He placed grains on the windowsill as before, and this time he placed more than enough for all of them. The birds pecked happily, while he watched with a heart overflowing with gratitude. From that day on, the cottage was never silent again. The little family of sparrows came each morning and each evening, filling the air with cheerful sounds and fluttering wings. The old man would sit outside in the garden, letting them perch around him, sometimes even on his hands. The villagers who once thought of him as a solitary figure began to smile when they passed by, for they saw how life had returned to his home through the company of small creatures. Children would stop to listen to the chorus of sparrows, and some would ask him why he spent so much of his time with them. He would answer softly that in their songs he heard the voice of compassion itself, for they reminded him that no being is too small to be loved, and no act of kindness is ever wasted. As weeks turned into months, the bond grew deeper. The sparrows were no longer just visitors, they were part of his daily life. He built a small wooden shelter by the side of the cottage, so they might rest when storms came, and he often left water for them during the warmer days of summer in return. The sparrows brought joy to his heart. They flew freely, yet always returned to remind him that love given freely often comes back in unexpected ways. There were times when he thought of his younger years, when he had been busy with work and responsibilities, barely noticing the small creatures around him. He regretted how often he had walked past them without care now in his twilight years. It was a sparrow that taught him the lesson he had overlooked all along, that to see the sacred in the small is to touch the essence of life. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, he sat quietly with the sparrows hopping about the garden, and he reflected on how different his life had become. Once marked by loneliness and silence, it was now filled with song and gentle presence. He realized that compassion is not limited by words or by form. It flows beyond the boundaries of species, and it binds all life into one great circle. In the stillness of that evening, he felt a profound peace, as though the entire universe had whispered its secret into his heart. Yet as the seasons continued to change, challenges returned. A harsh summer storm broke across the valley. Fierce winds tore branches from the trees, and heavy rain lashed the fields. The sparrows were frightened and clung to the shelter he had built. He stayed awake that night, watching over them, making sure the storm would not harm their fragile lives. He whispered prayers, asking the skies to calm. And when the morning came, the sparrows emerged wet and tired but alive. They fluttered around him with gratitude, and he felt as though their survival was his greatest reward. Compassion, he understood, was not only about gentle moments, but also about the courage to protect, to stay present, even when the world turned violent. In that storm, he saw his own fears mirrored in the small trembling wings, and in protecting them, he felt his own courage grow stronger with time. His relationship with the sparrows became a story told among the villagers. They came to see him not just as an old man in a cottage, but as a guardian of small lives. Children loved to visit, bringing crumbs of bread to share, and often asking to hear the tale of how it all began. He told them simply that one cold winter, a small sparrow came to his window and taught him how to love again. Some laughed, some listened in awe, but all left with a seed of thought planted in their minds about kindness to creatures weaker than themselves. The sparrows, too, seemed to sense that they were safe in this place. They built nests nearby, raising their young, who soon learned to fly and sing, and so the chorus grew richer each season. The old man sometimes wondered how long he would live, but he no longer feared the end, for he felt that his life had already been fulfilled through the gift of sharing love with beings who asked for nothing but received everything he could give. He saw in them the reflection of all beings who seek happiness and who tremble before suffering. He saw that compassion is the thread that binds the great and the small, the strong and the fragile into a single fabric of existence. And every time he heard their wings flutter, he remembered that no act of kindness ever disappears. It becomes part of the great song of life that echoes across time. One autumn morning, as leaves began to fall and the air grew cooler, the sparrow perched on his hand and sang a note so pure it seemed to dissolve all sorrow. He closed his eyes and listened, feeling as though that single song carried the wisdom of the world. He thought of all the years he had lived, the people he had lost, the loneliness he had endured, and he realized that even in the face of all that pain, a single song, a single gesture of compassion was enough to heal his heart. He whispered to himself that when the time came for him to leave this world, he wished to go with the sound of sparrows in his ears and the warmth of compassion in his heart. And, as if the sparrow understood, it sang louder as the sun rose, gently lighting the path of another day. As the golden hues of autumn deepened and the chill of the approaching winter began to weave itself into the early mornings, the old man found himself reflecting more often on the journey that had brought him to this point in life. He had once lived in a world filled with people, family, and responsibilities, but now the rhythm of his days was guided by the simple presence of the sparrows that fluttered around his cottage. Each dawn he awoke to their song, and each dusk he closed his eyes to the gentle rustling of their wings. For him, time had taken on a softer meaning, one not measured by the ticking of clocks, but by the flow of seasons and the companionship of creatures who asked for nothing but gave so much in return. He thought of how easily he might have dismissed that first sparrow on the winter night when it appeared cold and trembling on his windowsill. He could have turned away, he could have chosen to remain in the silence of his own world, but instead he opened the window and offered a handful of grains, and in that simple choice his entire existence had been transformed. He now understood that compassion is not always born from grand gestures, but often from the quiet willingness to see another being's suffering and to respond with whatever one has to give. The villagers, who once thought of him as a solitary old man, now began to look at him with new eyes. They saw how his cottage had become alive with song, how children gathered there to listen to the birds, and how a man who once seemed forgotten by the world had become a symbol of kindness and simplicity. Many of them began to bring their children to learn from him, not through lectures or formal teachings, but through example. They watched how he treated the sparrows with patience, how he allowed them to live freely, never caging them, never binding them to his will. And in this they began to recognize a deeper truth, that compassion means allowing others to flourish according to their own nature, even when it means letting go. One evening, as the harvest moon rose above the fields, casting silver light across the quiet village, the old man sat in his garden with the sparrows perched nearby. He spoke softly, not to anyone in particular, but to the night itself. He said that life had taught him many lessons, yet none more important than this: to love without expecting to own, to give without measuring the return, to cherish without clinging, and to trust that even the smallest act of compassion ripples through the universe in ways unseen. As he spoke, the sparrows chirped as though responding, and the sound blended with the stillness of the night, creating a harmony that felt both ancient and eternal. But life has a way of testing even the most peaceful hearts, and so it was that the old man fell ill when the first frosts of winter touched the ground. His body weakened, and he spent many days lying by the fire with only the crackle of flames and the soft presence of sparrows to keep him company. They perched on his windowsill as though keeping vigil, and sometimes hopped inside to sit quietly near him, their small eyes watching with concern. He felt comforted by their presence, but also aware that his time might be drawing near. Instead of fear, he felt gratitude. He thought of how he had once expected to die alone in silence, and how life in its mysterious kindness had given him the gift of companionship and meaning through the wings of a small bird. And now many birds, he whispered to the sparrows, that if he should leave this world soon, he hoped they would remember not him but the love they had been given. He prayed that they would continue to sing, and to remind whoever heard them of the gentle truth that compassion sustains life. One morning, when his strength had nearly faded, a knock came at his door. It was one of the village children carrying a basket of food. The villagers had noticed that he had not been seen for several days, and they worried for him. Touched beyond words, he thanked the child and invited him inside. As the boy sat near the fire, the sparrows fluttered close, unafraid of the child. The boy watched in wonder and said he had never seen birds trust a person so completely. The old man smiled weakly and said that trust is born when kindness is constant, when you give without harm, and when you protect without control. The boy listened with wide eyes, and later, when he left, he carried that lesson with him. The villagers continued to care for the old man, bringing food and visiting often. The sparrows too remained ever near, their presence lifting his spirit even when his body grew frail. He realized then that compassion multiplies like seeds scattered by the wind. What began with a single act toward one small sparrow had spread into the lives of children, villagers, and even back into his own soul. He had not only given love, but had received it in return in forms he had never expected. As the days shortened and winter returned in full strength, he often gazed at the sparrows huddled in the shelter he had built for them. He marveled at their resilience, at their ability to find joy even in hardship. He whispered that they were his teachers, that their song had shown him how to live more than any book ever could. One night, as snow fell softly outside, he dreamed of walking in a vast meadow filled with light where countless sparrows flew freely above him, their wings shimmering in the glow. They sang together a song that seemed to echo through eternity. When he awoke, he felt no fear, only peace. He knew that whenever his time came, he would join that great chorus, not as a sparrow perhaps, but as part of the same compassion that bound them all together, one particularly harsh morning when frost covered every branch and the air itself seemed brittle. The sparrows gathered more closely than ever near his window. The old man smiled faintly as he watched them. He whispered that he loved them and that they should live fully and freely no matter what happened to him. The sparrows chirped in response, their voices rising together as though offering him strength. He closed his eyes and felt warmth in his heart, a warmth that no winter could ever extinguish. He thought of all the beings in the world suffering in silence, and he sent them a silent blessing. May you find compassion. May you find safety. May you find peace. And in that blessing, he drifted into sleep. When he awoke again, he was still alive, weaker, but alive, and outside the first signs of spring could be felt. The snow had begun to melt, the sun shone more boldly, and the air carried the promise of renewal. The sparrows sang louder than ever, as if celebrating his endurance. He realized then that life had given him a little more time, not for himself, but to share once more the lesson he had learned. He spoke to the villagers who visited, telling them that the heart grows richer, not by what it keeps, but by what it gives. He urged them to see every creature as part of their own family, for in truth, all beings are connected through the same desire to live and to be free. The villagers listened and carried his words with them, passing them on to their children and grandchildren. The story of the old man and the sparrow spread quietly, becoming a tale of the village itself, a reminder that compassion is the greatest wealth a human can hold. The old man felt no pride in this, only humility and joy, for he knew that the true teacher had always been the sparrow, and that he had simply been blessed to listen one last time as the sun set and painted the sky with shades of pink and orange. He sat in his garden with sparrows perched all around him. He closed his eyes and whispered thank you, not only to the birds, but to life itself. And in that moment, he understood that his journey had never been about loneliness or survival, but about discovering the boundless depth of love that lives in even the smallest act of compassion. And as the sparrows sang their evening song, he felt complete, he felt at peace, and he felt that everything in the world was exactly as it should be. The cycle of seasons turned once more, and as the village fields ripened in shades of green and gold, the old man continued to live quietly with the sparrows as his daily companions. The bond that had formed between them was no longer a fragile connection born from chance, but a deep and steady presence that wove itself into the rhythm of his days each morning. The sparrows arrived before the sun had fully risen their wings, stirring the cool air, their song calling him from sleep, and each evening they settled near his cottage as if to assure him that he was never alone. His body was weaker now, but his spirit glowed with a strength that surprised even him. It was as though the love he poured into those small creatures had come back to him as light, filling his heart with warmth. He often sat outside beneath the great tree that shaded his garden, watching the sparrows build their nests. He marveled at their tireless work, gathering twigs and straw, weaving them carefully into safe places for their young. He thought of how similar their efforts were to human lives, always seeking safety, always working for the ones they loved. Yet the birds did this with a grace and simplicity that made him question why people so often complicated the art of living. He realized that perhaps wisdom lay not in grand philosophies, but in observing the natural way of things. He had learned from them patience in waiting for the right twig or the right strand of grass, persistence in flying back and forth despite the fatigue, and above all, tenderness in the way they shielded their eggs with their bodies, keeping them warm and safe as weeks passed. The eggs hatched and tiny voices joined the chorus of the garden. The old man listened with wonder to the faint chirps rising from the nests, like the fragile beginnings of life itself. He felt privileged to witness it, and though his hands trembled with age, he still found ways to help, placing small grains of food near the nests, so The parents would not have to fly too far when he heard the hungry cries soften into contented silence. He felt joy, as though he too were feeding his own children again. Memories returned to him of years long past when his own children had been small, when he had carried them on his shoulders and soothed their cries with lullabies. Those days had slipped away into distance, but in the voices of the sparrow chicks, he heard echoes of his own past, and he was grateful for the chance to feel it again. One evening, a group of villagers came to visit, bringing with them offerings of fruit and bread. They told him that the story of his friendship with the sparrows had inspired them to teach their children kindness toward animals. They said that when their children saw stray dogs or cats, they now offered food instead of stones, and when they saw small birds, they watched with curiosity instead of trying to capture them. The old man's eyes filled with tears as he realized that the lesson of compassion was spreading beyond the walls of his cottage into the hearts of others. He thanked them not with pride, but with humility, for he believed that the true gift came not from him, but from the sparrows who had chosen to trust him. The villagers stayed for a while, sharing stories and laughter, and when they left, the old man felt a deep peace, knowing that even when his time came to leave this world, the seed of compassion would continue to grow in the soil of the village. His body grew frailer. As months passed, there were days when pain visited him, and his hands ached too much to chop wood or carry water. Yet every time he thought of giving up, he heard the sparrows calling outside, reminding him that life, though fleeting, is always worth cherishing. He saw in their daily flight a lesson about resilience. They faced storms and hunger, and yet each day they sang. He told himself that if such tiny creatures could endure with joy, then surely he too could endure a little longer. One morning, as the first frost touched the grass, he felt the weight of age more heavily than before. He sat by the fire and spoke to the sparrows perched on the windowsill. He told them that his journey might be nearing its end, but that he was not afraid, for he had seen with his own eyes the power of kindness to transform loneliness into joy and fear into peace. He told them that when he was gone, he wished for them to continue singing for the world, to remind those who listened that compassion is the song of life. The sparrows chirped in response, their voices blending like a chorus of blessing, and in that sound he felt a sense of completion, as if the universe itself acknowledged his words. He closed his eyes and rested, letting the warmth of the fire and the presence of the sparrows cradle him as though he were a child once again. In the days that followed, his strength waned further. The villagers visited often, bringing him what he needed and sitting by his side. Listening to his quiet words, he spoke to them of the simplicity of love, telling them that compassion was not something distant or unreachable, but something that lived in every small gesture. A smile to a stranger, a crumb for a bird, a hand offered to the weak. He reminded them that when they acted with kindness, they were not only helping another being, they were healing themselves. The villagers listened, and many promised to carry his words in their hearts. One evening, when the sky was painted in soft colors of dusk, he stepped outside slowly, leaning on his walking stick. The sparrows gathered around him, filling the air with their fluttering. He raised his face to the sky and breathed deeply the cool air of autumn. He whispered, "Thank you to the world for allowing him to witness beauty even in his final days." And as he looked at the sparrows flying freely above, he felt no sadness, only gratitude, for he understood now more than ever that love is freedom, and to love truly is to release. Without fear, he returned to his chair by the fire and sat in silence. The sparrows perched nearby, their small eyes watching as though keeping him company in the quiet of that evening. He drifted into thought about the countless beings on this earth, each struggling, each longing for safety and happiness. He realized that though he was but one man in a small village, His compassion had reached beyond his own life. It had touched others and inspired change, and that was enough. It was more than enough. When night fell, he closed his eyes, listening to the sparrows singing outside, their notes clear against the stillness. He thought of how once he had been afraid of dying alone, but now he knew he would never truly be alone, for the love he had shared would remain in every wing beat, every song, every act of kindness. Carried forward by those he had touched, he smiled faintly as sleep embraced him, and in that smile was the quiet certainty that compassion is eternal. It does not end with the body, it continues in the world like ripples in a pond, expanding outward without end. And with that thought he drifted into dreams, where sparrows flew endlessly across a sky filled with light, their wings carrying the promise of love without limits. The winter that followed was colder than any the villagers could remember. The wind cut through the valley with a sharpness that made even the strongest men shiver. The fields lay barren under layers of frost, and the river that once sparkled in the sun now lay silent and hard beneath a sheet of ice. The old man's cottage stood firm against the storms, but inside its walls the air was heavy with both warmth from the fire and the frailty of his aging body. His days had become slower, his movements more careful, yet his eyes still lit up each time the sparrows appeared at his window. They came faithfully through the cold, as though determined to remind him that companionship does not falter when hardship arrives. He often spoke to them in hushed tones, telling them stories from his youth about the days when he was a boy running barefoot through the fields, when his mother called him in for supper, when his father taught him the meaning of hard work. He shared with them the laughter of childhood, the sorrows of loss, and the long years of solitude until they had returned to his life. He would tell them that they were more than birds to him. They were his teachers, his companions, his family, and he believed they understood, for they listened with a stillness that felt intentional, as if each chirp in response carried a message back to him of reassurance. One evening, as the snow fell thick and the fire burned low, the old man felt a weakness greater than before. His breath came shallow and his hands trembled. He looked toward the sparrows huddled in their shelter outside and whispered that he was not afraid. He told them that if he did not wake with the dawn, he wished for them to keep singing for the world, because every song of theirs was a prayer of compassion. He closed his eyes that night with peace in his heart, but when morning came, he opened them again to find sunlight streaming into the cottage. He smiled faintly, as if surprised to still be alive. He realized then that each day he had left was a gift, one he would use to deepen his gratitude for the life he had lived. He stepped outside with effort, leaning on his stick, and the sparrows flew around him, circling in the crisp air, as if celebrating his presence. He raised his face to the pale winter sun and whispered his thanks to the sky. Days passed, and his body weakened further, yet the visits from villagers grew more frequent. They brought him food and wood, they checked on his health and listened to his words. Some came with sorrow in their eyes, for they knew his time was near, but he comforted them, saying that no life is without end, and that what matters is not how long one lives, but how deeply one loves. He reminded them that his life had been full, not because of wealth or fame, but because he had discovered the boundless joy of compassion. He urged them to carry this forward into their own lives, to treat every being with gentleness, for in doing so they would find peace within themselves. The villagers left his cottage with heavy hearts, but also with inspiration. They saw in him the embodiment of a truth they had always known, yet often forgotten, that love is the only legacy worth leaving. One night, when the stars shone brightly against the black sky, the old man sat by the fire with the sparrows clustered near the window. He felt the weight of his years pressing upon him, yet his spirit soared higher than ever. He thought of all the lives he had touched and all the lives that had touched him in return. He thought of the first sparrow that had appeared in his darkest winter, and how that single moment had changed everything. He whispered thank you again and again to life, to the sparrows, to the villagers, to the unseen forces that had guided his path. He felt that gratitude pour through him, like light filling every corner of his being, and in that light there was no room for fear, only peace. As the fire flickered lower, he closed his eyes and drifted into a dream. He dreamed of walking in a great meadow filled with flowers and sunlight. The air was warm and the sky endless around him. Sparrows flew in vast numbers, their wings shimmering in the golden light. They circled him, singing in voices so pure they seemed to wash away every trace of sorrow. He walked among them, feeling lighter with each step until his body felt as free as theirs. He realized then that this was not just a dream, but a glimpse of the eternal truth, that life does not end, it transforms. It flows like the seasons, from winter to spring, from silence to song. He awoke with tears on his cheeks, not of sadness, but of joy, for he had seen with his own heart that compassion is never lost, it is carried forward into eternity. The days that followed were quiet. He grew weaker, but he no longer clung to the world. He lived each moment with the awareness that it might be his last, and in that awareness he found freedom. He savored the taste of simple meals, the warmth of the fire, the song of the sparrows, and the laughter of children who came to visit. He realized that when one accepts the impermanence of life, each moment becomes infinitely precious. One morning, when the frost still clung to the earth, but the first hints of spring stirred in the air, the old man sat outside, wrapped in blankets. The sparrows perched around him, chirping joyfully, as if sensing the change of season. He smiled and whispered that they would soon see flowers bloom again, and that they should continue to sing for all who needed hope. His voice was faint, but his eyes shone with light. He told them that he had no regret, that his life had been filled with meaning, because he had learned that compassion is the essence of existence. As the sun rose higher, the sparrows took flight, circling above him, their wings catching the light, and he felt as though they were carrying his spirit upward with them. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the warmth of the sun wash over him, and in that moment he knew that whenever his final breath came, it would not be an end, but a return to the great song of life he had heard in his dreams. For compassion is eternal, and love never fades. The early days of spring arrived slowly, as if the earth itself was reluctant to shed the heavy cloak of winter. The snow melted into streams that whispered softly through the valleys, and the first buds pushed bravely through the thawing soil. The old man, who had grown so weak over the long months, felt a gentle stirring within him, as though the warmth of the sun was lending him its strength. He sat often by the open door of his cottage, wrapped in blankets, his face tilted toward the light, while the sparrows flew busily around him, gathering twigs and straw to build new nests. Their songs filled the air, and it seemed to him that the entire world was singing of renewal. The villagers came often to visit, bringing food and water, and sometimes simply their company, for they knew that his time might not be long yet. They also saw how peace radiated from him, and in his presence they felt calmed, as though his serenity was a fire that warmed them against their own fears. He spoke gently to them, reminding them that life is like the seasons that change without end, and that just as winter yields to spring, so to sorrow yields to joy. If one has patience, he told them that compassion is the root of all strength, and that to nurture even a small life is to align oneself with the great harmony of the universe. The children especially loved to hear his stories, and they would gather around him, asking about the first sparrow that had come to his window. He told them again how cold and weak it had been, how he had offered it food and warmth, and how that simple act had grown into years of companionship. He explained that kindness often begins so small that we hardly notice it, yet it grows and spreads like the branches of a tree, shading and sheltering more lives than we can count. The children listened with wide eyes, and sometimes They reached out their hands to the sparrows that flitted nearby, marveling at how tame and trusting they were. The old man smiled. Watching the seeds of compassion being planted in young hearts, he felt a deep satisfaction knowing that, when he left this world, the lesson would not leave with him, but would continue through them. One afternoon, as the fields shimmered in the sunlight, he felt a sudden surge of energy and decided to walk slowly into the meadow behind his cottage. The sparrows followed him, chirping brightly as though celebrating. His steps he moved carefully, leaning on his stick, yet with every step he felt lighter. As though the earth itself was carrying him, he stopped by a small stream, now flowing freely after months of ice, and watched as the water sparkled in the light. He whispered to the sparrows that life is like this stream, sometimes frozen and still, but always moving beneath the surface, waiting for the warmth of compassion to set it free. The sparrows sang in response, and he closed, his eyes feeling the truth of his words. In the very air around him, in those quiet walks, he found himself reflecting on all that he had learned. He realized that compassion had not only saved the sparrow, it had saved him as well. It had drawn him out of the prison of loneliness. It had softened the sharp edges of grief. It had given him a reason to rise each morning, and a peace to rest each night. And now, as he neared the end of his journey, it gave him courage to face what lay beyond. He understood that death itself was not an enemy, but a continuation. A season after winter, leading into spring. He no longer feared it. Instead, he welcomed it as part of the same cycle that guided the sparrows, the trees, the rivers, and the stars overhead. One evening, as the sun set in hues of rose and amber, the sparrows perched all around him, and he felt a wave of love, so profound it seemed to dissolve every boundary between himself and the world. He whispered that he was grateful for every moment, the bitter ones and the sweet, for every moment had led him here to this place of peace. He thought of his family, long gone, and of all the faces he had known through his years. He wished them all happiness wherever they were. He wished even the strangers and those who had wronged him happiness, for he understood now that holding anger only imprisoned the heart, while releasing it set the spirit free. He spoke softly to the sparrows, telling them that they must continue after he was gone. They must keep singing, keep living, and keep reminding people that compassion is never wasted, even when it seems unnoticed. It plants seeds that grow in silence and bloom in time. The sparrows chirped in reply, and he felt certain that they understood. He felt his breath slow as he gazed at the fading light, and he wondered if this might be his last sunset. But instead of fear, he felt a deep calm, like the still surface of a lake reflecting the sky. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the chorus of sparrows, and allowed himself to simply be present in that moment. The following days were filled with visitors. More villagers came to see him, bringing small gifts of food, flowers, or simply their prayers. They told him that his life had touched theirs in ways words could not express. Some said they now noticed the birds in their gardens with new appreciation. Others said they had begun teaching their children to treat animals with care. Others still said that his story had helped them endure their own loneliness and pain. The old man listened with tears in his eyes, humbled that such a simple life could ripple outward to touch so many. He told them that he had done nothing extraordinary, that all he had done was open his window to a small bird in need, and that anyone could do the same with any being who crossed their path. He urged them not to wait for grand opportunities, but to act in small ways every day, for in those small acts lay the greatest power. He spoke with a quiet conviction that came not from books or teachings, but from lived truth, the truth that compassion is the essence of being alive. When the visitors left, he sat quietly with the sparrows. Once more he felt weaker with each passing day, yet his spirit grew ever lighter, as though preparing to take flight with them. He dreamed again of the meadow of light, where Countless sparrows flew, and each time the dream grew more vivid until he began to feel that he was already halfway there. He awoke from those dreams with a smile, certain that the boundary between this life and the next was thinner than a feather. One morning, as dawn painted the sky in pale colors, he whispered to the sparrows that his time was near. He thanked them for every song, for every moment of companionship, for teaching him the lesson of love. Without words, he told them that when he left his body, his heart would remain with them, and with every being who sought kindness. He closed his eyes for a long time, breathing slowly and deeply, then opened them again to see the sparrows circling above their wings, glowing in the light. He knew then that when the final moment arrived, it would be like this: a gentle letting go, a return to the vast sky, where compassion flows without end, and love sings in every wingbeat. The days of spring grew longer and warmer, and the earth once again wore its cloak of green. The fields surrounding the village filled with young shoots that swayed like gentle waves beneath the sun, and the air was alive with the hum of insects and the songs of countless birds. The old man sat often in his garden, wrapped in a blanket. Though the air was soft, for his body had grown frail and thin, yet in his eyes there was a brightness that seemed untouched by age. He watched the sparrows with a serenity that spoke of acceptance as they darted through the sky, carrying straw and bits of grass for their nests. He listened to their songs and thought of how their voices were like threads weaving together the fabric of the world. He realized that even the smallest life plays its part in the great harmony, and in that recognition he felt a quiet joy. He spoke less to the villagers now, for he had little strength, but when they came, he welcomed them with a smile and gentle words. Sometimes he shared memories of his childhood, the smell of freshly tilled soil, the laughter of his brothers, the way his mother's hands had felt when she guided his own small fingers to plant seeds in the earth. He told them that all these moments had been precious, even the hard ones, for they had brought him here to this final chapter, and he wished for them not to fear the passage of time, but to see it as a river carrying them forward, always toward new shores. He reminded them that compassion was the one thing that gave meaning to it all, that wealth would fade, and youth would fade, and even memory would fade, but the kindness we give endures beyond us, like light traveling endlessly through space. When the children came, he asked them to care for the animals they met, to be gentle with the stray dog, to feed the bird that landed on their window, to remember that every being, however small, carries the same wish to live. He told them that when they grew older, they would see sorrow and loss, but that compassion would always be the lantern that guided them through darkness. The children listened, wide-eyed, and though they did not fully understand, they carried his words in their hearts. One afternoon, he felt a deep weariness overcome him, unlike any he had felt before. He sat in his chair by the open door, the sparrows flying about him, their wings glinting in the sunlight. He closed his eyes, and for a long time simply breathed, listening to the rhythm of the world, the wind rustling the grass, the distant laughter of children, the flutter of wings. He felt himself sinking into the moment, as though the boundaries between him and the world were dissolving. He thought of the first sparrow that had come to him, that cold winter night years ago, and how it had changed the course of his life. He realized that the bird had not only been saved by his kindness, but had saved him as well, from despair, from loneliness, from closing his heart. He whispered thank you to that small life, though it was long gone, and in that gratitude he felt peace greater than any he had known. As twilight came, he drifted into sleep, and in his dreams he walked once more in the meadow of light. The sparrows circled above, singing their eternal song. He felt his body grow light, until it was as though he too had wings. He soared among them, free of pain, free of sorrow, and in their chorus he heard the voice of the universe itself, whispering that love is endless, that compassion is eternal. When he awoke, he knew that time was near. He told the villagers who visited that he was ready, that he felt no fear, for he had seen what awaited beyond, and it was only another season, another spring. He asked only that they continue to live with kindness, that they remember to see every creature as their kin, for in that way they would honor not him, but the truth that binds all beings. Together the villagers wept quietly, but they also felt comforted by his serenity. They promised to remember his words and to teach them to their children and their children's children. He smiled, knowing that the seed had taken root and would continue to grow in the soil of their hearts. The next morning, the sun rose bright and clear. The sparrows gathered at his window, singing louder than ever. He opened his eyes to their chorus, and for a moment, he felt young again, his heart light, his spirit soaring. He whispered farewell to them and to the world around him. He closed his eyes once more, and this time he did not open them again. His breath grew soft and still, and in that stillness he slipped gently from the world like a leaf carried by the stream. The sparrows sang on, their voices rising into the sky as if to carry him with them. The villagers who came later found him at peace, his face calm, his body resting as though in sleep. They mourned his passing, but they also celebrated his life, for they knew he had left behind not sorrow, but a legacy of compassion they cared for. His cottage they tended, his garden, and they watched over the sparrows who continued to nest there each year. The story of the old man and the sparrow spread beyond the village, carried by travelers and told by parents to their children. It became a tale of kindness that reminded all who heard it that even the smallest act of love can transform the world, and so his life did not end. It flowed onward like a river in every act of compassion, inspired by his story and every song of a sparrow that reminded people to live gently with all beings. In this way, he lived forever, not in body but in the hearts of those who remembered, and in the endless song of life that echoed through the wings of sparrows. After the old man's passing, the cottage remained standing at the edge of the village, weathered by seasons, yet warmed by the memory of his life. The sparrows that had once filled the air with song continued to return each morning as though they carried his spirit in their wings. The villagers noticed how even after his death the birds still gathered there, and they took it as a sign that the bond between him and the sparrows was not broken but had simply changed form. Children ran through the meadows pointing at the sparrows and whispering the story they had heard from their parents about how an old man had once saved a small bird in the harsh winter, and in return had been saved by the gift of companionship. Elders spoke of him with respect, saying that he had lived simply but had left behind a lesson more valuable than gold. As time went on, the story spread beyond the borders of the village. Travelers who stopped to rest heard the tale and carried it with them to distant places. Soon, the story of the old man and the sparrow was told in towns and cities across the land, in homes around firesides, in schools where children gathered, and even in temples where monks used it to illustrate the truth of compassion. Each telling changed, slightly shaped by the voice of the storyteller, yet at the core, the truth remained the same, that no life is too small to be cherished, and no act of kindness is ever wasted. Seasons turned, and new generations were born. Children grew into adults and taught the same story to their own little ones, so the memory of the old man never faded. It became woven into the very identity of the village and those who lived there. When spring came, the villagers often placed small bowls of water and grain outside their homes in honor of the man's compassion. They felt that by feeding the birds, they were not only helping the sparrows, but also continuing the love that he had once shared. They noticed how the sparrows seemed to multiply, filling the fields and gardens with song, and they believed this was a blessing, a living proof that kindness always returns. Multiplied, many of the villagers confessed that their own hearts had changed since knowing him. They no longer saw animals as insignificant, they began to see the divine spark in all creatures, and they felt a gentleness toward the world that softened even their hardest. Day's parents taught their children not to crush the ants on the ground, not to harm the stray dogs, not to pluck flowers needlessly, but to honor life in all its forms, and the children grew with this awareness as naturally as they breathed. The sparrows too became symbols of hope to the villagers when storms came and the wind threatened to tear the roofs from their homes. The people looked to the sparrows, who braved the storm with fragile wings and drew strength from their resilience. When sorrow visited and someone lost a loved one, they listened to the song of sparrows and remembered that life moves in cycles and that love never truly disappears but transforms into new forms. The story of the old man was also carried into temples, where monks told it to remind their students that enlightenment is not distant or hidden in difficult texts but revealed in the simple act of compassion to another being. They said that the old man, though not a monk, had lived with the heart of one, for he had embodied the teaching of kindness without expecting reward. In this way, his life became a lesson that touched even those who sought wisdom in the highest truths and found it reflected in the smallest bird. As the years passed, the cottage itself became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Villagers and strangers alike visited to sit by the old man's chair, which was still kept by the fire. They said that in the silence of that cottage, they felt his presence, as though his spirit lingered there not to haunt, but to bless people, left offerings of seeds and water for the sparrows, and in return the sparrows filled the air with their joyful song, as if acknowledging the love that continued to flow through that place. One boy, who had listened to the old man's words as a child, grew into a teacher himself. He often told his students that what he had learned was not from books but from the example of one man who had shown him that true strength lies not in power but in tenderness. He taught his pupils to look after stray animals and to treat their peers with patience. He told them that the sparrows had been his first teachers, and that through them he had understood the value of every life. His students carried these lessons forward, and so the influence of the old man's compassion spread like branches reaching out from a tree, touching lives far beyond what he could have imagined in his lifetime. And still the sparrows sang through each season. They nested in the trees around the cottage, they raised their young, and year after year their voices filled the valley. The villagers came to believe that the birds carried the old man's blessing in their song, that when they sang it was as if he was still whispering to them to be kind to each other, to live gently upon the earth, and to remember that love is the only true wealth. Some nights, when the moon shone bright and the village lay still, the people swore they could hear the sparrows singing more sweetly than ever, and they said it was because the old man was singing with them from the other side of the sky. These stories became part of the fabric of their lives, not myths, but truths that guided their actions. So when disputes arose among neighbors, they often resolved them by recalling the old man's story, asking themselves what kindness he would have shown, and in that remembrance anger often softened and forgiveness became possible. Thus his compassion continued to heal even after his body had long returned to the earth. Children who were not yet born when he lived grew up knowing his name and his story. They felt as if they had known him personally because his spirit was alive in the sparrows that still fluttered about the village. The circle of compassion he had begun never broke. It grew wider and wider, like ripples in water, reaching further than even the villagers could see. In this way, the old man who had once been alone in his cottage lived on, not as a shadow, but as a light illuminating paths for generations to come. And the sparrows who had once been saved by his kindness now served as messengers of that light, their wings carrying the memory of a man who had understood the most profound truth, that to love without condition is to touch eternity. Time moved onward, and yet the story of the old man and the sparrow continued to ripple across the lives of those who carried it in their hearts. The cottage still stood, though its wood grew darker with age and the stones of its foundation wore smoother from the passing seasons, but it remained a place of warmth, not because of the fire that once burned within, but because of the love that had been poured into it. The sparrows never abandoned the place. They nested in its eaves, they perched on its windowsills, and they sang each dawn as if to keep alive the memory of the one who had once opened his hands to them. Villagers would pause on their way to the fields to listen to their chorus, and many whispered silent prayers of gratitude for the lesson of compassion that the birds embodied. Children continued to gather around their parents and grandparents to hear the tale told again and again, and though the words shifted with each telling, the essence remained the same, that a single act of kindness had grown into a lifetime of meaning, and that the love given to one small life had blossomed into countless acts of compassion shared by others in distant towns. The story became a parable carried by travelers, recited by monks, and even written into books that taught about the sacredness of life. There were those who doubted such a tale could be true, yet even they felt their hearts stirred when they heard it, because truth is not always in the details, but in the message, and the message was clear, that love knows no boundaries of size or form. The sparrows themselves became symbols to those who heard the tale. People began to see them not as common birds, but as messengers of remembrance. Whenever a sparrow landed on a windowsill, it was seen as a gentle reminder to live kindly and to open one's heart to the small and the overlooked. Parents told their children that the old man still lived in the song of sparrows, and so the children grew up with a reverence for life, carrying forward the seed of compassion into their own journeys. The village flourished, not in wealth or grandeur, but in harmony. Its people were known for their gentleness and hospitality, and travelers often remarked on how different the air felt there, as if the very soil held kindness. One boy who had once visited the cottage became a man and a teacher. His name carried across lands as a voice of wisdom, and yet, when asked where he had learned compassion, he would smile and say it was from an old man who had saved a sparrow in the winter. He told others that what he had been given was not doctrine, but example, and that example was more powerful than any words. He urged his students to act with kindness in the smallest matters and to see the divine reflected in every being. And so the story lived not only in the memory of the old man, but in the countless lives touched by the example he had left behind. The sparrows multiplied year after year, and with them grew the legacy of compassion. Sometimes when storms came and tore through the valley, the sparrows clung to the trees and endured their tiny wings, battered but unbroken, and the villagers who watched them took courage from their resilience, remembering that the old man too had endured many winters and had met each one with patience and love. Thus the sparrows became living teachers, reminding people that fragility and strength walk hand in hand, that to survive is not only to resist, but also to trust in the unseen rhythm of life. One evening, long after the old man had passed and his cottage had become a place of pilgrimage, a group of children sat under the great tree near his garden, listening to their grandmother tell the tale. Her voice soft and slow, like the rustle of leaves, she ended by saying that every being carries within it the same longing for warmth and safety, and that when we honor that longing in others, we honor it within ourselves. The children looked to the sparrows that flitted above them, and in their young eyes there was no doubt that the story was true, for the song of the birds was living proof. In that moment, the cycle continued. The old man's love had become the grandmother's words, and those words became seeds in the children's hearts, seeds that would one day grow into acts of kindness of their own, and so the chain of compassion extended further across time. The sparrows flew on across the seasons, their wings writing invisible. Verses in the sky, verses that spoke of love without end. Travelers came and went, monks and teachers recited the story, parents whispered it to children, and children grew into parents who whispered it again, and through it all the essence remained. Pure, that one life, however small, holds infinite worth, and that compassion given without expectation becomes eternal. The old man's name faded with time, perhaps forgotten by history, but his spirit lived on stronger than before, for love needs no monument, it lives in action, it breathes in the way one being looks upon another with tenderness. It continues in every song of a sparrow, in every smile offered to a stranger, in every hand that lifts another from the cold. The cottage eventually crumbled, the roof gave way, the wood returned to earth, yet even as it did, the sparrows still returned to the place, as if honoring the soil that had once held their sanctuary, and the villagers built a simple marker there, not of stone or grandeur, but of wood, with a single word carved into it: compassion. And those who passed by would pause to reflect, sometimes leaving seeds for the sparrows, sometimes whispering a prayer, sometimes simply smiling in silence, but always they left changed, in small ways, reminded that life is precious and fleeting, and that love is the only legacy that remains. The sparrows kept singing through summers and winters, through storms and clear skies, and their song carried the story across time and space until it belonged not only to one village or one people, but to the world itself. And even as centuries turned and the details blurred, the truth endured, for compassion is eternal and love never fades. And so the story of the old man and the sparrow continued, like a river without end, flowing through hearts that chose to listen, through voices that chose to tell it, and through the wings of sparrows that chose to sing. In the quiet unfolding of this story lies a truth that echoes beyond the walls of one humble cottage and beyond the fragile wings of a sparrow. It teaches us that compassion is never small. A handful of grains offered to a trembling bird may seem insignificant, yet in that act the old man transformed his own life and the lives of many around him. The sparrow did not only survive, it returned again and again, carrying with it the reminder that kindness creates bonds stronger than fear, and love, freely given, multiplies in ways we cannot measure. The old man began as a figure of solitude, facing the harshness of winter and the silence of an empty home. Yet through one simple gesture, he discovered the vastness of connection. His story reminds us that compassion is not limited to words or beliefs. It is action, it is presence, it is choosing to open the window when the world outside seems cold and indifferent. Through him, we see that no life is too small to matter, and no heart is too old to love again. His legacy was not wealth, nor fame, nor monuments. His legacy lives in the sparrows that continue to sing, in the villagers who teach their children gentleness, and in the countless hearts touched by his story. The lesson is clear. To love without expectation is to touch eternity. As you carry this tale into your own life, may it inspire you to look with softer eyes upon every being you meet, and may it encourage you to cultivate kindness in ways both great and small. Let the story of the sparrow remind you that the world becomes brighter not through grand gestures, but through everyday compassion. If this story has brought you peace, comfort, or reflection, we invite you to join us again. Subscribe to Buddhism for sleep and allow each night to carry you into rest with tales that nurture the heart, calm the mind, and awaken the gentle wisdom already within you.